So my name is Daniel Maynard. I'm an associate professor here in the People and Nature Lab. For those of you who don't know, the People and Nature Lab is part of the Center for Biodiversity and Environment Research, which in turn is part of the Department of Genetics, Evolution, and Environment. And the goal, the ethos of the People and Nature Lab matches that of UCL East. And the idea behind UCL East was to bring together people, groups, centers from across UCL and embed them together in this truly multidisciplinary working environment to implement challenge, problem-driven solutions, in our case, to environmental issues. So although we're part of biosciences, the People in Nature Lab involves people from geography, people from computer science, from the Bartlett connected environments, robotics, all through this lens of trying to develop and implement solutions to environmental challenges. And we do this by blending ecological understanding with technology, building sensors, AI, artificial intelligence. Again, all through this lens of not just studying the world around us, but trying to develop solutions. So things like monitoring biodiversity loss through time, trying to understand how ecosystems are going to change through time. So this is the inaugural event for the People in Nature Lab seminar series. And when we were trying to think of who is a good first speaker, Professor Dunnett's name came up as the first name. And that's because his work really epitomizes what we're trying to do here. So Professor Dunnett it really has pioneered this innovative approach to integrating ecology into landscape design. And he does this by moving beyond this idea of just viewing landscapes as ornamental, but actually trying to design landscapes in a way that are multi-use and also can address things like sustainability, biodiversity, and even climate change. Professor Dunnett started with a bachelor's in botany, moved on to get a master's in landscape ecology from the University of London, and eventually got his PhD from the University of Sheffield. And that's currently where he's a professor of, let me get this right, professor of planting design and urban horticulture at the University of Sheffield. He's published numerous books on landscape design, and he's the director of the Green Roof Center. And again, what really sets Nigel apart, at least from our perspective, is he's approaching this question as a scientific problem. So he's approaching landscape design through experiments, through research, trying to understand ways that you can implement biodiversity, sustainability into landscape design to scale it up in a responsible way. Some of his numerous projects that I'm certain many of you are familiar with is designing the landscape outside of the Barbican, the Tower of London super bloom, that again, I'm certain many of you have seen this. And then, of course, right outside here, he was the principal planting designer for the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. So again, really epitomizes what we're trying to do here, this idea of blending people and nature and realizing that any solution to the climate crisis, to the biodiversity crisis, has to implement both of those things simultaneously. With that, I'd like to have a big warm welcome to Professor Dunnett, and I'll hand it over to him.
Thank you. It's great to be here. So, the work that I've been doing at the University of Sheffield and before and outside of that for 25 years now has been about bringing colourful nature into cities, and in particular into the places where people are. And one of the themes I want to talk about really is, you know, what do we mean by nature in the first place? Nature is different things. I think we should see it as different things depending on where we're working and who we're working with and who it's for or who it's with. And the colour is a really important thing. I'll just talk a little bit about that in a moment. So that's the background context. I guess I've been working a lot with meadow-type landscapes, and as Daniel said, is based upon a huge amount of research. Myself and my colleague James Hitchmo, who's just retired from the University of Sheffield, I've really been working on a program of research into sustainable landscape planting, which blends together ecology and horticulture to achieve outcomes which work for people and for biodiversity and for nature. And it's expressed in different ways. And again, as Daniel said, both James and myself were extremely fortunate to be invited to be the principal horticultural advisors for the whole of the Olympic Park. And this is an image from 2012 taken directly across the water in one of the gardens. There's the other UCL building is now behind this, but when the park was first made, it really sat like an island of green with that empty space around it. And it's been incredible to watch it over the last decade, really, with the buildings development growing up in and around it, and to see that transformation to become such a vibrant part of the city. So talk a little bit about what we do, but I think when I talk about a people first approach, I want to explain that a little bit more, because to me, to switch people on to the idea of nature-rich landscapes around us in cities, we need to work in a particular way, perhaps, to do that, and perhaps to engage people's emotions in a very strong way. And just an example of that, I want to give my experiences of being in California in 2019 in the spring, and I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to experience the super bloom that happened in the desert landscapes. You can't really plan a trip in advance to see this because it's so unpredictable. It depends upon the whole range of things coming together, sometimes at the last minute climatically. But I just happened to be there, so I got to experience this, and went to see some of the places that were transformed with flowers. And this is a view to a mountain range. These are not hills, these are mountains from about 20 or 30 miles away. And the orange are Californian poppies. And the scale of the transformation of those landscapes is quite incredible. And from a distance, you see the sheets of color. It's a similar thing to heather moorlands, or the way mountains might be transformed in August into purple with heather. Interestingly, as you kind of get closer and closer into landscapes like this, what appears to be a uniform sheet of the same sort of thing becomes much more diverse. And at the small scale, such as you see in the bottom right corner, once you start to look in detail, these can be very diverse and sparkling mixes of different plant species, rather than just a single dominating plant, as you might get the impression. Anyway, I guess the thing is that these are dramatic and colorful, and they inspire people to go and visit them. And people visited in their millions. I think I went to this place, which was Walker's Canyon, and just over a weekend, 150,000 people traveled to get there. They're not really close to cities, so most people are driving 3 or 4 hours to get there. And once you kind of observe people walking through these landscapes, interesting things happen, in that people don't want to stay on the paths or the designated routes. People want to get off the paths and want to get in amongst the nature, the colorful nature. And this is just a small example of somebody wandering off the path to be in the middle of the flowers. And here's another example of people going in amongst it. And of course, it causes damage, and there's a lot of concern. In fact, I think since 2019, when there was so much pressure, these places are being closed off to visitors. But this sort of pressure only happens at the hotspots, where near entrances or car parks or whatever, it kind of peters out as you go further in. But of course, it is damage. But I saw so many images like this, or experienced so much like this, with people almost swimming in the flowers and bathing in the flowers, and everybody has their phones and cameras taking photos. And again, there's another criticism of this sort of thing, that it's a shallow type experience, that is the kind of, Instagram, social media, you drive out for 3 or 4 hours, get some photos, and then you go away again and post them. And it can be dismissed as very shallow. I think it's the opposite of that. I think this sort of phenomenon, and we see it all over, this phenomenon tells us something really profound, I think, about the need, the attachment, the deep need that we have for these sorts of amazing and incredible experiences in nature. Now, the thing is that this image and similar things, this is only available to people who know about it first. It's only available to people who can drive for 3 or 4 hours from the big cities to get to places like this. And it's only therefore available to people who can afford to get to places like this. So for a long time, I've really been thinking, well, why should that be such an exclusive experience? Why can't this be more like the everyday experience? Why can't people experience this in the park, along the highway, at the end of the street, in the schoolyard, in the backyard? Why can't that be something that's not limited to a small number of quite privileged people? Why can't that be something that we all get to experience? And I think really that's been at the heart of the sorts of things that I've been doing. It's been creating designed super bloom type experiences in much more everyday type situations. It's to, I guess, the aim is to promote or create or provide a setting for similar sort of deep and joyful and uplifting experiences that people seek out, but to have that in a way that's available to a much wider range of people. And I guess the biggest expression of that that we had was the chance to do exactly that here. In fact, this photo from 2012, from the Olympics here in London, was taken just a few hundred meters from where we are now. And this is a seeded super bloom, but just like in those photos from California of people going off the paths, the more you look into something like this, the more you see people in there. There's a guy there having his photo taken from the edge. There's a girl hidden amongst the flowers there. There's this magnetic urge to want to be immersed in it. And I think this sort of thing is very different to the way we experience a lot of designed landscapes that are provided for us, which is quite a passive experience, really. You kind of stay on the path, you stay on the lawns. There might be diverse planted areas. You kind of get to look at them and you might like them or not, but you very much observe and you're very much a passive participant. Whereas really, I think there is an inbuilt urge for people to want to be active actors and participants in something like this. And of course, it's not just the visual. When you're in the middle of something like this, it's overwhelming. You feel part of it. And it's the sound, it's the other life that's all around you as well, which again, we kind of are cut off from in much of our everyday type experience. So I think the power of working with, let's call it designed nature, there is the possibility to create really positive and uplifting, I think overwhelming experiences for people. They can be calming experiences, they can be restful experiences, therapeutic experiences, but they can be invigorating and refreshing and healing and energizing and joyful. And this is a hugely powerful thing that we have. And I speak as a university researcher who actively works with practice. And I think, again, one of the themes I suppose that might come out of this is the hugely important place that universities and research has in enabling things like this to work and to happen, because we applied probably 15 years worth of research that was done before 2012 into enabling things like this to be successful on the ground. And part of that previous research was done on the streets of Sheffield in housing estates and in places that normally don't get a lot of resources. And we were able to trial a lot of our techniques in meadow creation, in diverse landscape planting techniques in situations where people were. And that's quite different to a lot of research, which is often isolated from where people are, carried out in experimental plots or in labs or whatever. And it's always been very important to me to test things with people for real. I kind of found myself transitioning from being a botanist and an ecologist into being much more of a social scientist and sociologist in a way. Once you see the response and the way people engage and behave with these sorts of landscapes, and not people who have a highly educated informed background. To me, it's an instinctive thing. And it's partly to do with color, but it's partly to do with scale, I think, as well. And it doesn't have to be, look at me, flowers everywhere. It can be very calming and very restful. This is from the Barbican. We might talk about this a bit later on. But again, it's a very similar, immersive, natural experience that we're looking to create. And there are similar things, although there's no flowering plants here, a lot of grasses, but there's a repetition of the same elements over space, which again, I think starts to build up a sense of being in the middle of something. So I think, coming from a design background, but also a science background, this is a powerful thing. And when it's done right, it has the power to reach deep inside to people and to liberate feelings that are often buried. I think they're childlike feelings that often are held back. But there is the possibility to release those childlike feelings through design nature. And it is, I think, about naturalistic, diverse surroundings rather than formal, low diversity, controlled surroundings, if you see what I mean. The work we do, I suppose, not everywhere, but in certain hotspots, is about what we would call creating a sort of enhanced nature. Now, again, you might say that's a sacrilegious thing. How dare you? How dare you even use that phrase, enhanced nature? You're implying you can go one step better than nature. Well, yes, you can. I think you can, because not all nature is the sort of nature we want to live with all the time. And certainly in places where we're living and working and being, maybe we want a certain type of natural experience. And again, that often is a colorful one. We've done a lot of research which shows us that you can have very wild landscapes where people are, and if they're just green, they're often perceived as undesirable, as messy and untidy and with all sorts of negative connotations. You can have exactly the same thing and put some flowers in it and some color, and you get a very different response. And it's simply through having elements of flowers. And I think you can think about all sorts of evolutionary psychological reasons for why the presence of flowers or fruit or whatever makes the place more attractive than just something that's green. But there's something about having the color and the flowers that allows us to do things that maybe otherwise we wouldn't be able to do. I think by applying the research and the techniques and the knowledge, we can make an amazing immersive and joyful experiences for people. And in places where you wouldn't normally consider nature to be appropriate. And I think that's another thing that we have really worked strongly with. A lot of our techniques are about high density cities, rather than thinking that nature is for the natural places, or if you have a park, you put the nature bit the furthest away from where people are. Well, why not put it right at the entrance? Why not make it the first thing people see? Why not make it the totality? And why not turn our streets into gardens and make our streets the places where nature is in the cities of the future? And it's really exciting, as we'll see, that that's happening now on a big scale. So there is an aesthetic element to this, the connection with people, but it's goes beyond aesthetics. It's a deep emotional pull, I think. Now, I don't need to go into the non-aesthetic elements, but I'll just quickly say this, and it's something that we all understand, of course, that the major challenges that we face, the nature crisis, the climate crisis, the movement of peoples, the problems, the challenges associated with these are magnified in cities, of course, and magnified more in high density cities, because we've lost that layer of soils and green and nature that does so many beneficial things. And I don't need to go into that with you. But if you kind of accept that the negative elements, the climatic consequences of high density urban development is partly as a result of the loss of nature, then one of the big solutions for the future is to bring soils and nature and vegetation back into built development. And we would all say, well, of course, but I think that the difference now is that it has to be on a large scale. It has to be on a big scale. It's no longer enough to make a green roof on a building over there, or have a garden on a building over here, or have a rain garden over there, or a bit of meadow over there. They'll all have benefits, but they'll be very localized. Of course, the thing is that we have to make this connected and on such a large scale that the effects are large. So once we do that, then it changes the way we think about things and the way we experience things. It's transformational. And the Olympic Park here is perhaps a really nice example of that. I guess to me, to really make this transformational change, it does need to be planned for, it does need to be designed, it does need to be nurtured and helped and supported, rather than we just stand back and just let everything do its own thing, because sometimes the sort of nature that you hope for is not the sort of nature you get if you just stand back and don't have some sort of strategic overview. So this is a plea for the planning and design and architecture professions to be involved in all of this rather than to not be involved in all of that. And that's a great thing that it is central to the thinking of all these professions now. So transformational means that we look for every single opportunity to do it. These are some, it's interesting, I think a lot of our examples and experiences for green infrastructure, which we think here is a fairly recent thing, there's an ecological wisdom in other places that's been around for a long time. And these are some images from China. This is from a town near the city of Chongqing. I think, I don't know exactly how old these are, 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, sort of late 20th century. But really, these apartment blocks are rising up out of continuous urban forest on the ground, and this is a humid, hot climate. So on the ground, you've got a complete canopy over you. And then the rooftops are roof gardens, but they're food-producing roof gardens, they're productive roof gardens. So before the words green infrastructure were even thought about, there's been a lot of experience and practice in other places about how to create transformational living environments for people. As Daniel said, I've been involved with green roofs a lot, and this is one of the early ones I saw this 20 years ago in Chicago in 2003. And I'm not going to dwell on green roofs at all, but it's a kind of signal, a flag, I think, for all the benefits that bringing nature into cities brings. And it's a pioneering and really inspirational example by the city government in Chicago at the time, who were putting a lot of regulations in to tell other people what they had to do to achieve environmental benefit, and said to themselves, well, we can't really tell everybody else what they have to do without doing it ourselves. So they instigated a green roof on their building, but they only owned half the building. So they could only put a green roof on half the building, as you can see here. But this green roof incorporates many of the things that people are just talking about now. There's topography, there are hills and valleys on it. And the planting, the species were all those which grow within a 150-mile radius of Chicago, all native Midwestern prairie type species. But I guess the thing about having a green roof on half the building and a green roof not on the other half is that it brings the differences, makes it so stark what the differences are. You can just imagine if you moved a meter from one side to the other, how conditions change, how rainfall behaves on the green compared to the grey, how you would feel on a scorching hot day on the grey compared to the green. Where would you rather be if you were an insect or a bird? What would you rather look at? Now, these of course just seem so obvious, doesn't it? That the green is what we would all want to see and have, and the grey is not what we would not want to have. And yet our planning and development system continuously pushes the grey and ignores the green. And the grey part of this dichotomy is what we have all around us still. But we all know that that's not the right thing to be doing. And there's this mismatch, this complete mismatch between what we know is the right thing and what is promoted and pushed. And of course, part of the thing is that the green is more expensive than the grey. So I'm just going to read this little quote. I wrote a book on green roofs, and we put this in as the foreword by a piece of writing by the architect and artist Friedensreich Hunterdwasser, who produced buildings like this with forests on them. Everything under the heavens that's horizontal belongs to nature. We must be persistent in the quest to green or to forest all the rooftops. I think now this means every surface, not just the rooftops. So that from a bird's eye view, you would only recognize a natural green landscape. When you create green roofs, green surfaces, you don't need to fear the so-called paving of the landscape. We don't need to be scared of development if we do it in a way that's ecologically positive. The houses themselves become part of the landscape. People must use the rooftops and other surfaces to return to nature what we unlawfully took by constructing our homes and buildings. That layer of earth for the grasses and trees. But when we look at the opportunities for doing that, to create new parks and gardens, then it becomes very difficult, particularly because in a high density city, space is contested. So to be truly transformational, the traditional ideas of parks and gardens are just not enough, of course. So we have to look at all these other places, the rooftops, the walls, the pavements, the roads, the car parks, commercial developments, business parks, and parks and gardens. And what's certainly interesting in my world, in the sort of horticultural landscape design world, all of this first list of places are probably the most exciting places to be working now. On the streets and car parks and roads and rooftops is where the action is and where the most interesting things are happening. And then those techniques kind of get trickled down into application in parks and gardens, because to work in these other places, these non-traditional places, you need to work with technology and work with innovation to enable things to succeed. And then that technology and that innovation can have much wider application. But coming back to the title of this little talk, we've talked about greening cities and urban nature for decades and decades. The sort of first major publications came out post Second World War in the 1960s and beyond. It's still not mainstream. We kind of know how to do it, but it's not the default, it's not the mainstream. And I think one of the reasons for that is that sometimes advocates push the ecological benefits first and foremost. And it's almost like, if it's functioning, if it works ecologically, that's the main thing. It doesn't really matter what it looks like. We can educate people to understand it. And there's a lot of work, of course, in education and interpretation. I think that's got us so far. But why I talk about a people-first approach is that, to me, one of the ways in is to think about engaging with people first and foremost to get things done, and then you can do more and more of it. So to me, it must be beautiful and good for people too, as well as ecologically beneficial and functioning. Now, this is, of course, something we can argue about. Because in the city, we don't have natural soils. Everything you see behind us, if that's where we're facing in the Olympic Park, there's not a natural piece of soil anywhere. There's not a piece of natural nature anywhere, apart from a few little pockets maybe along waterways. Everything else is totally artificial and made. Because the climate in cities is different to the surrounding hinterland and countryside, looking to restore native ecosystems and bring them into the city is maybe not the only way to do it, and it's maybe not the best way to do it. And this is what I really want to raise some questions about, that the whole push of legislation here and around the world now is to restore native ecosystems in cities, but are we potentially spending a huge amount of resource and money to do things which require a lot of resource and money to keep them going, and are maybe not always the most appropriate solution? So in addition to that, I think we need to think about a sort of new nature or a future nature for cities, and to think about ecology in an artful, people-focused way, as well as a scientific, organism and community-focused way. So when we bring all this together, of course, we can do these incredible things for people and for the wider environment, purely by introducing and working with designed nature in our urban environments. And there are really economic benefits to it too. And the most obvious example, for good or for bad, is the High Line in New York, having huge economic benefit. But here in the Olympic Park is maybe one of the best examples in the UK of a landscape development having huge economic repercussions in the surrounding communities. So just to finish this little bit off, I think, you know, we can just transform everyday life by creating nature-rich, designed landscapes in high-density cities, and we can do it for people and for non-human life as well. So I guess I've sort of taken it on as a mission, really, to in different ways to sort of infiltrate transformational nature at every opportunity. And I think infiltrating has a hint of subversiveness about it. Part of it's planned, part of it's top down, but maybe a lot of it is also helping bottom up approaches. But this transformational idea does change how places look. It changes how they're experienced. It changes how they're used. I think crucially, it changes who uses them. But it changes how they're maintained and how it changes how they're managed. It's hugely challenging all around. And that's why there's sociological, human-focused studies here, and behavioral studies and organizational studies, all about how to enable this transformation for the benefit of us and the rest of life to be achieved. So I want to draw some examples, and again, raise some issues and some frustrations, I suppose, bring in a range of projects just to finish off with. See, it's an exciting time for transformational nature in cities. And things are happening now that maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you would think, well, that would never happen. So just a couple of examples, one of which I've been involved with, which is the Battersea Power Station development here in London. And regardless of what's gone inside the commercialization of the building itself, it's surrounded by huge areas of new landscape. And this area surrounding the building itself was part of which I was involved with. And it's really a giant meadow. And part of our aim was to give the feel of the brownfield ecology that was there before all this development happened. And it's on a huge scale. And I think to create something like this around such a well-known building that has such a commercial aspiration, even 5 years ago, you would say, well, that really is such a waste of space. We should be doing something different with that. Or why aren't we paving it all over a hard surface? Or why aren't we putting buildings there? But it just gives us an idea, I think, of what is possible. I think the really exciting project that's happened in the last few years here in London is the Strand pedestrianisation scheme, I took these photos this week, just a couple of days ago, on the one sunny day, summery day that we've had this week on Monday evening. And I can remember just a few years ago being stuck in traffic jams on this very spot. And I think just myself being in this sort of world, if someone had said to me 5 years ago that the traffic would be removed from the Strand and gardens would be put in their place, and you'd have this place that has space for people to use in all sorts of different ways, but has this very rich green content, I would just say, how can that be possible? How can you even imagine the amount of work that would be needed to take this conventional view of the city away? And yet this is happening here. And I think this is just a flavor of the sort of transformations we're going to see in the future. And I have a colleague whose favorite phrase is really, or the question is, where will the gardens of the future be? And his answer is, the gardens of the future will be on the streets. The streets will become gardens. And this current idea that they're dominated by cars and vehicles will start to become a very old-fashioned way of thinking. I guess that really is at the basis for the Olympic Park thinking, which 15 years ago we were just starting to work on site. And the philosophical thinking behind the design of the Olympic Park here was to turn the idea of a conventional park on its head. You know, the typical view of a British park of being mostly lawns with trees and flower beds. Well, the park here is mostly meadows and woodlands and wetlands with a few islands of lawns set within that, completely flipping the idea of what a park is. And particularly for the games, the idea was that people would be surrounded, immersed, be part of this very natural matrix. And here are some photos from those early days. This photo was taken from here, actually, looking across behind us. And this is pretty much the first time I came. And it's like I said, when we look at the park now, you think it's very natural, but everything about it, including the soils, is totally artificial. And certainly when we first came, this was just mountains of demolished buildings on the site. And most of this material was crushed and cleaned and formed part of the soil material for the new park. And here are some images just before the games opened in 2012 of the new landscape here, which was only 2 years old by this point, 1.5 years old, and already looking like it's been there for a long time. These meadows here were created through seeding of British native species, but in combinations you wouldn't find in the wild. They are kind of designed for their visual impact, for their floriferousness, rather than for their replication of native plant communities. And here's a photo from 10 years ago, a few years after the games finished. And I think it's true to say that the only thing in this photo that would have been there 5 or 6 years before is the sky. Everything else has been made and placed and created within 5 or 6 years of that photo being taken. And it's a really powerful image, I think, to show what can be done if you have lots of money to throw at a project at a particular time. So it's nice for me to reminisce here on some of the images from the last few years. And where the other UCL building has just gone up recently, behind it was a very extensive meadow-based landscape, some images here of it. Just wanted to focus a little bit on one of the most innovative things that we did in the park, I think. This is an image from 10 years or so, 2013, I think, 2012. And this is where the new cultural quarter is, the Sadler's Wells and BBC and so on. This is the development plot sitting, waiting to be built upon. And the hoardings are set about 5 meters back from the pathways. And then behind the hoardings, you have this plot waiting to be developed. But in front of it, we put in what we called stitch plantings. These were temporary plantings that were designed to sit there until the development happened, but were in effect designed to start a succession. So they were implemented in 2013, 2012, or 2013, and pretty much left to develop over time. And they've gradually disappeared from the park, but some of the best ones are still here. Just next to this building is the best one. There's still strips around the hoardings over the road and along to the pudding mill station area. Those are still the remnant ones, which are really amazing, I think. All the other ones have pretty much disappeared. But these were planted and seeded in 2013 onto a clean surface with a mix of bulbs, quick ruderal, annuals, biennials, planted perennials, and then pretty much left to develop over time. So this is year one. Some images of some of these development plots. Here's a strip with trees on. This has been built over horrendously now. So this is in the first year. I think I've got a timeline of some images of how this then changed pretty much over time until last year. So this is a year or two after that, 2018. And the colourful flowers were the seeded annuals, which then didn't seed because there was no disturbance. And gradually perennials have taken over, a lot of native wildflowers as well as garden plants within the mix. So this is 5 years after establishment. A lot of reseeding and moving around of the plants within that combination. Over the, I'm not sure if it's done now, but certainly every year, ecological surveys were carried out in the Olympic Park of invertebrates, whatever. And this area always came out as the biodiversity hotspot in the whole park, together with that meadow area behind the new building here. And interestingly, these are hybrid landscapes. These are not just native species vegetations, they're hybrids, but they've scored the highest of all the vegetation types, higher than the native plant-only vegetations in the park. So I just happened across some remnants of these last year. So I came to, on the light railway to Pudding Mill Station. I normally come by train, by tube, and just saw this, and I had forgotten about these completely. And this is 10 years after they were established, pretty much left alone. And a lot of urban invasive species have come in to mix with those initial planted species. I've been surveying these every year, and I'll probably do one more this year and then we'll publish it. This is a fascinating track record of how something like this can develop over time. And it's merged with the sort of typical urban brownfield spontaneous vegetation you might get on sites like this from that initial seeded and planted mix. So over the 10 years or so that these have been in existence, the number of invasive species, the language around this is horrible, isn't it? Of invading species and whatever. But the spontaneous species that come in by themselves has increased, interestingly. Which really brings us to the question of what do we mean by nature in cities, really? What is the nature of the future? And how does that fit with our current thinking about what we should be doing and current legislation? Because in many ways, the real nature in cities is what we see on places like this, which are the abandoned brownfield sites. These are some lovely meadows in Sheffield, just outside Meadowhall, which is a big out-of-town shopping centre. This former steelworks sites have just been demolished and left. And they're the most incredible urban prairies now with birches and willows. I can see pampas grass coming up behind, which is going to be a big invasive plant for the future. Michaelmas daisies, North American things, and buddleias. Took these photos last autumn. The most incredibly beautiful, rich landscapes, totally spontaneous. They are highly sustainable. They don't require anything to survive. They flower in autumn after most of our native wildflowers are finished, highly diverse, but there's a very high proportion of non-native species in there. And in terms of biodiversity net gain legislation, these get very low value. You know, they have no value whatsoever, really. There's a high proportion of bare ground and loose substrates. Again, that gets very low scores in biodiversity net gain credit weighting, but that's very positive for many invertebrates. The mature stages of habitats like this do get credits for biodiversity net gain, but you have to go through the early pioneering stages to get there. And that's the paradox of this type of thinking. To reach this mature stage, these plant communities have to go through their pioneering stages, which currently get no or very little credit value for biodiversity net gain. So there's a danger that biodiversity net gain will lead to destruction of these early pioneering stages to be replaced by, let's say, native wildflower meadows or conventional landscape, which will need water and resources and maintenance to keep them going, whereas this requires nothing. And it's going to be supporting quite a wide range of invertebrates and other life. So I think that to me, places like this are exciting. It's what I call future nature. And when we look at places like this, we can see evolution happening in front of our eyes. This is nature evolving, and it's evolving because of human disturbance and human influence, but that it's always done that since humans have been around. So this future nature, I think, is something that we should place great value on, and it should be the subject of a huge amount of research about the functioning of it. And equally, when we think about design landscapes like some of the ones I've just talked about, which are not based on just native plant communities, then these have great ecological value as well. But again, they're not recognized in current legislation as having ecological value. Many of you might be aware of the fantastic biodiversity audit of Great Dixter Gardens that was done in 2019, about 5 years ago. Great Dixter Gardens are some of the most famous gardens in the world, horticulturally very, very rich, but they're part of an estate that includes ancient grasslands and ancient woodlands. And 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, the country's leading experts across a whole range of taxa did very detailed surveys of the gardens and the surrounding landscapes. And the gardens, in many ways, parts of the gardens, the horticulturally rich parts of the gardens, came out as the biodiversity hotspots, even compared to the ancient grasslands and the ancient woodlands. There, of course, was interaction between those different elements. And yet, that richness, I mean, many national rarities found, invertebrates that were thought to be extinct in the area, new finds, not just pollinators, but the whole range of different life stages. The value of really well-designed, considered horticulturally rich landscapes is not given any value in current biodiversity legislation. So there's a huge amount of research that could be really useful to think about, well, what do the landscapes we see all around us have to offer? And can we work with those in a positive way and not just say, that's the right, good way to do things, and that's the wrong, bad way to do things, which is the way that a lot of legislation is pushing things currently. So are we kind of missing out part of the urban biodiversity mosaic by not acknowledging the value of carefully designed, complex, diverse urban plantings and the sort of future nature, spontaneous, urban, brownfield ecology and novel ecosystems, both of which score very low in current biodiversity net gain credit weightings? Should I finish there? Yeah. Just a few more minutes. So I just raise a couple of examples of how this is causing a slight issue. So two projects which are ongoing at the moment. And the first one is Grosvenor Square Gardens, which is the second largest square in London, and is undergoing a transformation in terms of design, which will be implemented later this year and into next year. And the square itself is a typical urban London square of lawn and trees, that's it. So you have a tree canopy of London plane trees, nothing in between, and then a lawn or a low diversity lawn. The design proposals propose a transformation that keeps a central lawn space, but there's a ring of shaded tree canopy around the edges to be transformed into a diverse, rich woodland garden with an immersive path that takes you around it, and some images of that transformation here. Because we have to go through current biodiversity net gain legislation for this, and we're working with mixed plantings, a lot of native plant species, but not native plant communities. So we have really diverse mosaic landscapes, communities on the ground. We have intermediate woodland edge and shrub layers and tree canopies. But in biodiversity net gain terms, these are classed as cultivated gardens, which again gets a low score, even though the transformation from lawn and London plane trees is going to be immense in terms of its biodiversity value. So we've had to score the uplift in different ways because we cannot achieve the credits in biodiversity net gain legislation, which doesn't really work for urban areas at the moment. So this is all classed as cultivated garden or introduced shrub, neither of which score highly in terms of biodiversity net gain. And the second project, which is a really exciting one, is a new roof garden on King's College Hospital, which will be built later this year. And currently, this is it. It's lifeless. And the proposal is to create a first in the world, which will be a ward in a garden. So not just a hospital garden that people go out and enjoy. The idea is that it'll be a fully functioning ward with full life support and all the facilities you need for people to be cared for fully who are critically ill in a garden environment. So it's taken a very long time to produce these proposals. And of course, the planting has to be multifunctional. It has to be therapeutic, it has to be sensory. It has to look good throughout the year. The idea is this is a very sensory garden that patients will be out there in the middle of winter experiencing all of the elements. We have trees and shrubs and herbaceous layer on the ground. But yesterday this is an example of how the beds will be outside, but it can be hooked up to these units here, which supply gas and air and data inputs. We had an email yesterday from environmental officer for the King's College Hospital Trust. And it appears there's a small proportion of native plants, shrubs and trees selected in comparison to non-native. From a biodiversity perspective, as a trust, we would be looking to maximize native species on the basis of restoring UK biodiversity and requiring information about why we haven't used mostly native plant species here. Given that this is the situation now, and that we're going to have a garden which is richly planted, which will have very diverse plantings and will present a considerable uplift, we still have the question raised, why aren't we using native plant species if we want to increase biodiversity? And this is a question really for all of us. Is the only way to promote wider biodiversity the use of native plant species? Because the research that we've done at Sheffield over the last 10 years or so, the Great Digital Biodiversity Survey, Royal Horticultural Society research, and others, suggests that the use of native plant species is only one factor. And in fact, some of the biggest studies suggest that nativeness is not the main factor in wider biodiversity. It's vegetation structure and its floriferousness of the vegetation, not necessarily whether it's native or not native. Of course, there are certain relationships between non-plant life and plant life, which are tied. But when you look at the bigger picture, is it right to always insist on the recreation of native plant communities in highly designed, highly urban environments as the only route to go down to achieve wider biodiversity gains? So I just raised that question because it comes up again and again in the development process. And questions like this have the power to veto a project now, purely on the basis of the list of plant species and where they come from. So I think I'm going to stop there because it's just a little hint, I think, of how much research and further research is needed to explore the nuances of people and nature and biodiversity, particularly in cities, and how we achieve optimal outcomes for all the different people and non-people involved. So I'll finish